Hi everyone, welcome to the Match+Book series on the EBPL podcast. I'm Paul. I am the Adult Services Librarian here at the library, and I manage our Match+Book form, which can be accessed through our website. Basically, you submit a list of reading preferences for things you'd like to read, genres, fiction, nonfiction, anything like that, and I will respond to it. So this idea is to take that and put it into an audio fashion so that you could also receive these list of recommendations. We're going to be touching on a number of topics, probably cover 2 per episode, and what I want to do is take it in a lot of different directions. The first question comes from someone who says they'd like to receive books about the tech industry, specifically biographies of people who became successful in the tech industry or made a career change to enter the tech industry. My first recommendation on this is a book called Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener. It's a memoir of her time in the tech industry. She worked in publishing for a bit and then moved from New York City to Silicon Valley. So I guess that's how she came up with the title Uncanny Valley. It's part memoir, but also part breakdown of the tech industry through her eyes. It's about her time working her way up through the corporate world and her interactions with people from all different major social networks, software companies, and about how people with the best intentions sometimes produce some of the worst work. What she digs at is how humanity is really the underlying factor in all of this, and how even with good intentions, they can still produce things that can have a detrimental effect to society. So things like financial chicanery, managerial manipulation, technological hysteria, things like that, especially in the startup world, where things are so chaotic and the mood seems to change from day to day. She does a great job of putting her own personal experiences forward and letting you understand how she experienced it to show that it's not all good, it wasn't all bad. This isn't a total takedown of the industry. It was about how misguided corporate culture can be on a major scale, and how that mirrors her understanding of humanity, and how when you get too many people together, too many ideas, the conflict is inevitable. She discusses working as a moderator of a software engineering company and how they had a team of 4 moderators for millions of pieces of software that were being generated, and how the corporate structures seemed to not understand why that was an issue. And that's just the tip of the iceberg for things like this. It doesn't seem unique to Silicon Valley, but I think that's kind of her point, is that this is everywhere. It's widespread, and there's no such thing as an ideal outcome in the corporate world. I wanted to mention another book called The Mastermind by Evan Ratliff. It is also about the tech industry, but in a way that is so dissimilar from Uncanny Valley. It involves a programmer working a normal programming job and how he went from that to running one of the largest prescription drug networks in the world. And this goes in so many different directions, involving how the DEA played a cat and mouse game, trying to hunt him all over the world, how there was investigative work from journalists, from people, every conceivable agency trying to track him down, to his own manipulation of his staff, who at times were often some of his closest family members as well, and then the betrayals from inside the organization and how they utilized that to eventually catch him. It's fascinating and terrifying at the same time. It's a real page turner, and it just goes in so many unpredictable directions. I often hear people talk about works that are stranger than fiction and how they like that kind of nonfiction book, that if you read that in a fiction book, it would seem so outlandish that this can't possibly be true. And you really get that vibe from this kind of book. The storytelling is excellent. The reporting is out of this world. He interviews so many people connected to this in so many different ways. It gets so intense that at times you will fear for the author's life, because he is putting himself in these situations where he's so within this criminal organization, trying to navigate how it works and interviewing these people while they're still working for this operation. So it's not the classic Silicon Valley biography that you'd expect, but it is so fascinating that I would really recommend it as an excellent read that touches on the industry in ways that I think are really pertinent to how it is expanding, how it's flourishing in the modern world. Our next matchbook question centers on self-help books. I don't particularly read too many. I don't know if you do, but the user wants a self-help book that isn't condescending, which I think is fair because a lot of them seem to pander, and I totally understand wanting something that seems a little bit more research-based, a little bit more practical. My first suggestion would be Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, a behavioral psychologist who won the 2002 Nobel Prize for Economics. It isn't technically a self-help book in some ways. It centers a lot on business, economics, psychology, but in these ways, it also mentions our thoughts, behavior, and biases. The basic structure of the book, what he has labeled the two systems of thought that we have. System 1 is fast, intuitive, often an emotional response. System 2 is more analytical, slower, methodical, and he tries to dig at why we often rely on System 1, even though we tend to understand that it's wrong. It often leads to making foolish, overconfident decisions when we shouldn't be overconfident. It provides a framework for how we can better understand our own line of thinking and how we could analyze this and reflect on this to produce a better outcome for ourselves, to cast aside these cognitive illusions and better understand our own intentions. Another book I wanted to mention is Range by David Epstein. It's also not technically a self-help book, but in some ways it is. It examines the most successful athletes, artists, musicians, inventors, people from all walks of life, and he tries to draw some type of similarities between these disparate fields. And what he concludes is that it's not always advantageous to specialize in one specific field. It's often better to be a generalist, to have range. And in this way, we learn how to approach situations from more creative aspects and how to gain interest in a number of different fields because there's an interplay between these interests that allows us to excel further on down the road. It's not just about going from point A to point B. It's about gaining a number of different skills that will propel us to success further on down the road. In this way, he's asking us to practice so many different things and to have confidence in branching out of our comfort zone and feeling free to fail at things that we might not otherwise have tried in the first place. And I think it makes it a self-help book by really emboldening the reader to try all of these different things that life has to offer. There's so much to be gained from a wide range of experiences, and I think that alone is an important thing to consider. It also encourages us to nurture gifts that might be latent, that we might otherwise not even know are there, and would never have been able to bring out from ourselves. So I would definitely give that one a shot. Another book, now, the point of this is to match you with books that you think are going to be good, but also I wanted to mention one that is very popular in the self-help genre, but I think is very detrimental. So I wanted to mention it for that very reason. It's by Angela Duckworth, and I think this book embodies a lot of what is wrong with the self-help market in how it teaches people that if they just follow the prescribed way of doing things in the book, that it will inevitably lead to success, that there's no obstacles that they cannot conquer if they follow these secrets within this book. So I think this book is emblematic of a lot of what is wrong. I'll give an example from the book. She talks about a waitress who rolled up her sleeves, worked hard, every restaurant she worked at, promoted, and now runs a Fortune 500 company. That is an incredibly unlikely scenario, and for every person like that, there's hundreds of thousands of people who don't end up in this scenario. It is such an unlikely example of something that will actually happen to somebody in real life. I would avoid this sort of book, even though it was on the New York Times bestsellers list, but I think she's presenting her research in a way that is intellectually dishonest, and this by the bootstrap mentality is not going to actually help people, which the whole point is to improve people's lives. but this book provides a pipe dream for that. So those are all I had for now. Next time, I will have more recommendations on a variety of topics and genres. You can listen to the EBPL podcast at anchor.fm/EBP library or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to Melissa Hosig, who is our editor and programming librarian. Thanks again. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Match+Book series on the EBPL podcast. My name is Paul. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here. What we try to do with Match+Book is match people with certain genres of books that are right for them. So I had a question come in on the topic of nature. They're a big fan of new nature books. It doesn't have to be brand new, but anything published in the last 5 years, they would like to take a look at. So they said they're a big fan of Elizabeth Kolbert. If anybody's read her book, The Sixth Extinction, it's an excellent book about how humanity is affecting the planet and the ripple effects of that. That includes things like bee colonies that are being destroyed and rainforests that are being torn down, and the effects that those have for the rest of humanity, people living thousands of miles away. So I'd like to start off with one I read recently. It is called What It's Like to Be a Bird by David Sibley. David Sibley is an American ornithologist and author. His latest book is a reference book on all different types of birds. He'll cover each bird for maybe 2 pages and provide an excellent illustration of said bird. It's a way of identifying the bird visually, but also he'll go into the characteristics of that bird and answer such questions as, can birds smell? How do they hear the worms or feel the worms that they're finding in the grass or in the mud? Is the bird that's at my bird feeder the same bird that was there last year? Is it migrating the same path? He'll go through things such as songbirds, shorebirds, game birds, all different types, to provide a foundation of how to perceive these birds, their characteristics, how they impact their environment, and how they make the most out of their environment. One of the joys of the book is that you could pick it up at basically any page and read for maybe 4 pages, set it down, come back, and pick it up again. It could be enjoyed in these little bits. You don't have to read in order. Read it at your leisure. Also, unless you're a huge bird fanatic, chances are you'll learn quite a lot, such as some birds can sleep in the air. I had no idea that was possible. Or that birds have flexible lenses that could allow them to focus in the water and in the air. But that's just a little bit of what the book has to offer. I learned something new on every page, and you really can't go wrong with the mix of science combined with this picture book quality to it. And at the end of the book, I found myself not only just learning about birds, but appreciating them and what they do for the world and how they survive. The next book I wanted to discuss is Islands of Abandonment by journalist and author Cal Flynn. Now, my issue with a lot of modern nature books is that they tend to be either too alarmist, as if the world is ending tomorrow, or they tend to be too bright-eyed, too hopeful. And I think it's only right to find a middle ground in that, and that's what the author does with this book. She travels to places that have been ravaged by humanity, where the living conditions are nearly impossible, but where nature is making somewhat of a comeback, and what this means for humanity. She asks us to consider what is the consequence for all this ruin, and what is it likely to do to us all if we ignore the consequences of this. And the result is a twisted form of nature writing applied to things that are really catastrophic. And we find resilience in the locations that she travels to. She went to Chernobyl, where people are still living there, and where much of the animal population has returned to the area. And the people there are risking their health because of the radiation, but it's fascinating to see the reasons they've stayed, how they interact with nature, and how they've become part of the landscape without hardly any electricity. She'll also travel to demilitarized zones between countries to see how many of the demilitarized zones go on for an expanse of 50 to 100 miles. So she was able to work her way into there to figure out how nature is rebounding in those kind of places as well, because they're relatively untouched in those spaces. I think my favorite chapter in the book was when she went to an island called Swana, which I'd never heard of. You probably haven't either. It's off the coast of Scotland. It's been abandoned by people for roughly 100 years, and there's been wild cattle there that have been repopulating the island. She used the term rewilding, going back to an entirely undomesticated way of living. And it's a rare object of study, fascinating to look at. A total picture view of her work is full of danger, alarm, and threat, but at the same time, you also get this feeling of the possibility, natural recolonization and adjustment, and the possibilities within that sphere as well. It is a really nuanced take on a difficult subject, and I think she walks the line very well between optimistic and pessimistic. The next question we have here is about books on the subject of found family or a ragtag group of misfits. The person specifically requests books that will show how the characters grow together throughout the book to solve a common goal, or how they become better friends over time. I had actually read a book about a group of people who became found family, and usually that would take on a more traditional fiction route, but through this, it was a mystery. It's called The Postscript Murders by Ellie Griffiths. It's the second in a series, the first being The Stranger Diaries, but you don't need to read the first to enjoy the second, because it goes in a different direction. Although I must say the first was an excellent start to the series. I would put it in the cozier side of mystery novels. Fans of Anthony Horowitz, Agatha Christie would enjoy this one. It is partially set at a nursing home or retirement community, which I noticed has been a major trend in cozy mysteries over the past 2 years or so. And I've read a few of them. I must say I don't particularly like them. I find them trite for the most part. But this book, I think, does an excellent job of incorporating that aspect into the overall narrative. So it starts off with the death of a 90-year-old woman from a heart condition. Doesn't seem suspicious. Doesn't seem like it would prompt any further investigation, but it turns out the woman had an unusual background, some sort of involvement in a international crime ring, and she has crime novels in her apartment, all of which are dedicated to her, making for a very strange setup to the novel. The people who take up the cause of trying to find the murderer are people who this woman had an impact on. She positively affected their lives, and they think they owe it to her to find her killer. So, these people have very little in common with each other. Some of them were her helpers at the nursing home or friends of those people. Others are residents of the nursing home. So, the age gap alone makes for an interesting dynamic between the characters, often leading to very humorous situations. Of course, they work with the police force as well, so it's a group of armchair detectives working with actual trained detectives, and it makes for an interesting interplay between the two paths. It's an interesting and layered read. You get to see the characters develop in ways that you wouldn't normally expect, and I would say my favorite aspect of so many cozy mysteries is that it is difficult to predict who the actual murderer is, but if you follow some of the breadcrumbs she puts out there, it's also possible to solve the murder if you're reading very closely. I love when authors make it difficult, but also possible to go about it in this way. Another book I'd like to discuss on found family, ragtag group of friends, is Every Heart a Doorway by Shannon McGuire. It's a fantasy novel where children are slipping through portals into magical worlds. They will often come back to the real world, but have a tough time adapting, which I can't really blame them. If I slipped through a portal into a magical world, I think I would also have a difficult time returning to civilization. So our story is set at a home for wayward children who have returned to the world and are experiencing these difficulties. The children at this home try to find a way to pull together and try to understand what went wrong, why they were the ones to fall through these cracks, and why they're at this home, and why this woman is running this home. This is such a large concept, but she manages to write the whole story in just 170 pages. So the writing is really concise and tight, and the world building is done so quickly, but in a way that brings you right into the atmosphere. And even though it's written about children, there's a certain level of maturity, which I guess you would gain from experiencing these kind of things so young in life. I hope you like those recommendations. The EBPL podcast can be listened to at anchor.fm/EBPL library or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, thanks to Melissa Hosick, who edits the podcast. Thank you, and see you next time. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Match+Book series on the EBPL podcast. My name is Paul. I'm your host. I'm the adult services librarian here at the library. Now, Match+Book, we like to match people with books of certain genres or subjects that are right for them, and we'll try to show you some books you might like that maybe you haven't heard of before or maybe haven't read yet. So the first question here is somebody looking for books that have a combination of adventure and humor for fans of City of Girls and The Extraordinary Life of Sam Hell. These are two great genres that really mix very well. There are a lot of books on this subject. I'm going to try to cover more books than I normally would, but just to get started with one I've really enjoyed is called The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared by Jonas Jonasson. And yes, he is very Swedish. The title, while very long, is also very descriptive and true to what the book is about. A man on his 100th birthday, he's in a nursing home. They're planning a big get together for him, and he's not very interested. He wants to leave the nursing home. He still feels like he has more life to live outside of it, more adventures to go on. And he doesn't know where this adventure is going to take him, and he doesn't really know where he wants it to take him. So it's really open ended in that way. You don't know where the book is actually going, but you could tell this man is so determined to have a nice time somewhere else. And you find yourself rooting for him throughout the book to make the decisions that will lead to these grand experiences and journeys. I would describe it as a Swedish version of Forrest Gump, only with a little bit more humor and a little bit less drama. I don't want to go too in depth and spoil the whole plot, but he ends up interacting with a lot of famous people from history and influencing a lot of events the way Forrest did in the book and the movie as well. A little tidbit is he befriends Albert Einstein and encourages him to leave his job at the patent office and become a full-time scientist. Obviously an outlandish thing to happen, but the book isn't trying to be realistic. It's trying to be larger than life. It's trying to be grandiose in this way. And it not only wants to take this man, Alan, on an adventure on his 100th birthday, but it's trying to take you, the reader, on this adventure as well. You find yourself not knowing where it's going to go at every turn. And in this way, you're living it out with Alan, and it makes for a great read. The book is translated from Swedish, but it doesn't lose any of the humor through the translation. The next set of books I want to focus on is the Dirk Gently series by Douglas Adams, the famous author of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. But I wanted to take something a little bit less well known, but also by him, he does have the knack for adventure and humor that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is obviously well known for. But the Dirk Gently series is also excellent. It is 3 novels. It begins with Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. This series is great for teens and adults, and it follows Dirk Gently, a self-styled private investigator. I say self-styled because he is extremely amateurish, but in a way that is very amusing. He has his own quirks, has his own fundamental ways of approaching the job that many would find unhelpful toward solving mysteries, but for him, they really work. It plays on a lot of well-trodden tropes of the mystery genre, and you could feel Adams including all these complex subplots, connections, associations, and let them explode into one epic culmination point. And he's great at achieving this end. It's a detective story, it's a ghost story, it's time travel, romance, comedy. It is so many genres all packed into one. If you're looking for something like this, you can't go wrong with the Dirk Gently series.
The last one on this topic I wanted to mention, it's not just one book, but in general, the works of Christopher Moore. Nearly all of them follow this combination of adventure and humor. They are unfailingly funny and they follow such different topics as well. I'll just discuss two of the books I've read by him just to give you a little taste of what they're like. One is called Fool, and it's a hilarious new take on Shakespeare's King Lear, seen through the eyes of Court's Fool. This goes in so many directions where the fool is obviously making so many jokes and gags. It is filling the pages, but he's also the butt of so many of these jokes as well. The real genius at the heart of this work is that it keeps the basic events that we know from King Lear mostly intact, but it completely remodels how we view the text in a way that's bawdy, hysterical, and incredibly smart and tightly written as we follow the fool who acts as our eyes and ears throughout the book. Another book that I also enjoyed is called Bloodsucking Fiends, and it follows a woman who is unexpectedly turned into a vampire overnight, and she has to make sense of this totally new reality she's been thrust into. I think that's what more books do very well, is that they're grounded in reality, but they use fantastical elements that are spread out over the course of the work to really bring home how bizarre and insane these situations are that our protagonists find themselves in. Nearly all of Christopher Moore's books follow this combination of humor and adventure. I wanted to move on to our second topic of the day. It is fiction books about nature. In the last episode, we covered nonfiction books about nature, but I've also received questions about fiction books that have a lot of themes to do with nature. So I wanted to tackle that subject as well. One of my favorite authors who writes a lot about nature is Peter Heller. He wrote a book a few years ago called The River about two friends, Win and Jack, who have been friends since freshman year of college. They've been through it all together and they're taking a canoe trip in northern Canada. What starts out as a nice leisurely stroll through the mountains turns into a meditation on survival and man's path into the wilderness. It also touches on their friendship as well. We meet a lot of unexpected characters along the way, some of whom help along their journey, help Jack and Win through the mountains, others who are not as friendly. Peter Heller does a masterful job of painting a picture of this wilderness landscape and the friendship, getting to the heart of how so much of this simple outing is turned on its head by nature. Nature is the force that is really at the heart of the novel. The prose is just masterful. It is very simple, very well executed, and can make this story almost too realistic in ways that have such an emotional resonance to it. It shows how in everyday life, there's all these risks that are posed to us, and it's a disquieting story about coping with the random, unforeseen events that really have a hold on us. Peter Heller also has a new novel out called The Guide that's set at a fishing lodge in Colorado and a plot to uncover what is actually a more sinister operation lurking beneath this picturesque lodge. I haven't read it yet because it just came out a few months ago and I'm still on hold for it. So I'd love to talk about that more, but unfortunately I cannot. So check that out. If you've read The Dog Stars by him, if you've read The River already, definitely check out The Guide as well. I'm looking forward to it, and I know you will too. The last book I wanted to talk about today is A Piece of the World by Christina Baker Klein. She is the best-selling author of Orphan Train as well. It is an excellent book that has a lot to do with nature, but is also historical fiction in some way. And it's interesting how she couples these elements. So it concerns Christina Olson, a physically handicapped young woman at her family's remote farm in the town of Cushing, Maine. Now, Christina Olson was a real person from history. She posed for the painting Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth. It's the painting with the small girl sitting in the field, staring up at the barn and the house. It's one of my personal favorite paintings, which is why I was inspired to read the book in the first place, and it did not disappoint. The book builds on the themes of the painting in a way that renders it very atmospheric. because what we're seeing is the world through Christina's eyes, the way she has to get around, the way she can't even go into town or provide for herself in ways that leave her feeling extremely discouraged, but at times emboldened to want to make the most of her ailments. Andrew Wyeth, the character in the book that it gets based on the real Wyeth, of course, comes to stay at the family's farm, and he uses the landscape around Maine as inspiration for his works, which actually happened in history, but Klein is putting her own spin on these historical events. The outcome is that we get to know the actual person behind the famous portrait as we vividly see a complicated relationship with her family, her past, and with the natural world in a way that feels honest. She's bitter, she's frustrated, but at times extremely hopeful. She doesn't want anybody's pity, but is miserable at times. What ultimately happens is we see her making peace with the world around her, and you could see the beauty of the world through her eyes. And it's very powerful, very sad, but also hopeful story at the same time. So if you're interested, please check out any number of those books. I just want to remind everybody that the EBPL podcast can be listened to at anchor.fm/EBP library or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again to Melissa Hosig, our editor for the podcast, and for you for listening. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Match+Book series on the EBPL podcast. My name is Paul, and I will be your host. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at EBPL. And in the Match+Book series, what we try to do is touch on different subjects and genres of books and match people with books that might be good in those subject areas. So we're going to deviate from that format a little bit this week. Since this episode is coming out toward the end of the year, I wanted to talk about my 5 favorite books that I've read this year. Now, not all of these were written this year. I just happened to get around to reading them this year. But it still fulfills what I think of as the purpose of the series, which is to cover different bases. So I tried to pick out fiction, nonfiction, some contemporary, some historical, and give different perspectives on each. These are in no particular order. I just wanted to get my 5 favorite ones out there. So let's start with The Doctor's Blackwell by Janice Nomura. Now, this did come out in 2021, and it's the story of Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell, 2 sisters who, in the mid 19th century, became the first women to receive medical degrees in the United States and to practice medicine in the United States. It's part memoir in a way because it documents Elizabeth and Emily's relationship with one another, but it also has to do with their achievements and progress in the field of medicine, how they were aided along the way by administrators and professors who went out of their way to train them and accept them into the universities. There's actually a great anecdote from the book on this matter where they left it up to the students in the medical college that Elizabeth applied to either accept or reject her. The professor was very straightforward with the students, said, "Here's the deal, and you get to vote." And they accepted her on the basis that they thought the professor was joking. They thought the idea of a woman applying to medical college was so absurd that they all thought it was a practical joke, and they accepted her. So that's how she originally became a medical student. This book is chock full of great anecdotes like that and about how people reacted to a woman wanting to become a doctor at this point in history. It also touches on, obviously, people weren't as welcoming as you'd expect. So they were stonewalled along the way in wanting to practice, and people who would take them on to their practice, they found it very difficult to get research positions, any type of physician positions in America. So they were often going throughout Europe where they were a little bit more advanced on this subject of accepting women into the field. And while they were tremendously successful, I would say the book is inspiring in this way because they overcame a lot of obstacles, but it does a good job of remaining nuanced with regard to their personal temperament and character and how they could be somewhat off-putting in ways. So it does a great job of accepting the imperfections and realizing that the good they did for women and for the world was ultimately worthwhile and critical to the field. It is truly a well researched biography that brings some fascinating historical figures to life, figures that I personally had never heard of before. And I love to find biographies about people who were decidedly instrumental in their field, but that ultimately there's not too much public awareness of. Another great book I read this year was Normal People by Sally Rooney. She recently published another book this year called Beautiful World, Where Are You? Which I'm still on hold for. I'd like to get around to that one too, but Normal People is great as well. It concerns Connell and Marianne, two teenagers who are very different on the surface, but realize they have a lot in common in terms of how they see the world, how they have difficulty in getting to know other people their own age. They find it difficult to express themselves. And while they have this incredible bond with one another, they always seem to not be clicking in unison. And there's a lot of subtleties about family, friendship, class, and the psychological aspects of a relationship, how they get together, break apart. The book follows them over the course of several years. We can see the ebbs and flows in the relationship, how they grow together, grow apart. And it makes for a story that is profoundly lonely at times, but also hopeful at other points in the relationship. I certainly wouldn't call this a romance novel. What sets this book apart from so many other books that try to tackle a similar topic is that there's a precision in the way Sally Rooney writes that feels almost painfully true. She's able to conjure this tension and emotion to scene and convey feeling in a way that, as you read the book and get to know more about the characters, it feels really specific to themselves. The interplay between these two characters is so earnest and true and at times very uncomfortable to read in the way that it feels too particularly honest to the developments from young adulthood to adulthood and how we begin to understand our emotions on a much deeper level. Another book that I particularly enjoyed this year is The Splendid and the Vile by Eric Larson. You may know him as the author of Devil in the White City about the murderer H.H. Holmes. This book, Splendid and the Vile, is about Winston Churchill and England during the early days of World War II, when Churchill had just taken over as prime minister and the Germans were waging a relentless bombing campaign, killing 45,000 Britons. It shows Churchill as this charismatic leader, which we all know he was, but it's interesting to see it on a day to day basis, how he was able to rally the troops and rally the citizenry to have faith that they will still win the war. The Germans bombed facilities that they knew were important to the war effort, like manufacturing plants, but they also wanted to bomb residential areas because it wasn't just about the hits to the war effort. Specifically, it was about degrading the morale of the English people. And what you see from Churchill is this uncanny ability to inspire faith in the English people. Larson does a great job of drawing on diary entries, archival documents, secretive intelligence reports, all of these things to paint a comprehensive picture of the state of England throughout 1940, 1941, and England's relationship with the United States as well, and how the United States, until Pearl Harbor, gradually became a piece of the Allied war effort. Another book I particularly enjoyed is The Sellout by Paul Beatty. It is a comedic novel about a young black man who tries to reinstate segregation. And if that sounds outlandish and bizarre, that is also how it comes across in the novel. In doing so, the protagonist reveals a lot of truths about race in America, and there's a lot of social commentary on race relations. The book often feels like it's equal parts Dave Chappelle type of humor combined with the eerie, almost ethereal qualities like Kurt Vonnegut. The author has such a deep sense of style, and I found myself laughing every time I picked up the book. But keep in mind, it is also incredibly vulgar. So if this seems like something you're interested in, definitely pick it up. If it's not really your style, I'd probably avoid it. The last book of this episode is Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard. It is a biography of President James Garfield, who was one of the more forgettable presidents. I almost feel like this is unfair to him. He was born into abject poverty, became a scholar, a Civil War hero, and a reformist congressman all before taking office. He was an incredibly intelligent man, probably one of the most intelligent to be president of the United States. He wasn't out for glory. He didn't even want to become president. He had to have the nomination forced onto him. He wanted to be a low-key leader from the sidelines, didn't revel in the glory of the presidency and what that could afford him. The author does a great job of making Garfield come across with vision and integrity. And unfortunately, he was shot a few months into his presidency by Charles Guiteau. He lingered for months, and this is a large section of the book as well. How he maintained his faith that he might be able to survive the shot, and how he managed to lead from a hospital bed as he was slowly bleeding to death and being infected from this bullet. Years before Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, he also invented another, I don't want to spoil it, but he factors into this story as well, inventing something that tries to save Garfield's life. The end result is a great story that shows the overlap in history of Guiteau, Garfield, and Alexander Graham Bell, and shows a slice of history that is often overlooked, a time and place that maybe we don't know as well as we should. And the end result is a book that is decidedly enjoyable, but also you'll find yourself learning so much along the way. I love when a history book can both provide information and entertainment at the same time. And I found it great fun to learn about everyone who's involved in this case. So those are my favorite books that I read in this past year. And thank you for joining me again. The EBPL podcast can be listened to at anchor.fm/EBP library or wherever you get your podcasts. Melissa Hosick is the editor, so thanks to her, and thank you all for joining me yet again.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Match+Book, a series on the EBPL podcast. My name is Paul Kibala. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here, and I will be your host. This is our final episode for the time being, but we hope to get another limited run series of the Match+Book podcast going again this spring with all sorts of different topics and genres to cover. So please, I'll be asking for your questions and we'll be responding to them in the next few months. Our first question today is from someone who says, I like books that make you think, but I also like to change it up a bit with humor and romance. I love reading Jodi Picoult books because they are usually controversial topics and thought-provoking. So I tried to choose some books that meet, because those are different criteria, but I tried to square the circle a little bit. And the first suggestion I had doesn't really touch on the humor as much. It's more about the thought-provoking, controversial nature of it. But the next two, I tried to fold that in a little bit more. So the first suggestion I would have is Little Fires Everywhere, which was recently made into a miniseries for television with Kerry Washington and Reese Witherspoon. This book came out in 2017. It's by Celeste Ng, who is also the author of Everything I Never Told You, which came out several years before that. So this book really touches on a lot of themes that I think our question asker is looking for. It concerns a family in the Shaker Heights neighborhood of Cleveland, which I'm not sure if anybody's aware, but it's generally known as an upscale, very nice neighborhood. And it concerns a family who owns their own house, and they have a house nearby that they rent out to other families. And the matriarch of the family, Miss Richardson, she tries to rent out to people who she thinks need a break in life, need a little help. So she rents it out to a traveling artist named Mia and her daughter. This situation starts out with the best of intentions, but the families quickly intertwine in ways that set off a number of thorny ethical and moral topics. It starts with the fact that there's class issues involved because of the Richardsons' wealth, Mia and her daughter's relative poverty to that, as well as Mia and her daughter are Black and the Richardsons are a white family. So there's a host of compelling and intriguing issues that arise as a result of bring up issues of motherhood, adolescence, race, rules, right and wrong, ethical concerns, things like that. So I would definitely put this in the thought-provoking and controversial area. And anybody who is looking for that with a compelling backbone of a story as well, it's not just hitting on themes, but the story itself ties these themes together in a way that is very intriguing. I would definitely recommend that one. My next recommendation is a little bit lighter, a little bit on the more comedic side, but still contains some themes that I would consider thought-provoking as well. It's called Reincarnation Blues. It's by Michael Poore, and it concerns a man named Milo who is on a quest to be reincarnated 10,000 times in an effort to unlock the secrets of immortality, to discover how he could become the best version of himself he possibly could be. If that sounds ridiculous and obscene, it's probably because it is. I would recommend this for fans who also like reading Neil Gaiman, Kurt Vonnegut, Terry Pratchett, that kind of literature. These seemingly unending quests from all different walks of life take us on so many different paths that we wouldn't normally go down. So we're going from the future to the past. We'll be transported from India back to Renaissance Italy, back to present day. So the author uses this reincarnation quest to go down so many different lanes and really mine that for humor, but also pathos, I would say, as well. He has a lot of interesting things to say on how to discover your best self while also keeping it whimsical at the same time, and this combination makes for an excellent read, I would say. The last book I wanted to recommend on this subject is Spoonbenders by Daryl Gregory. It concerns the Telemachus family, who is famous in the book for performing inexplicable feats of magic and of the psychic nature on late night television. And one day on live television during one of these feats, the magic fails to materialize and they are shunned from the limelight for what they think is forever. A series of very wacky events arises where the CIA, the mafia, and a horde of unrelenting skeptics kind of draw them out of seclusion, and there's kind of a resurgence of the family, and this goes in all different directions that you couldn't possibly imagine when you start reading the book. It's interesting to see how the family has progressed from when they stopped performing to current day in the book is 1995, how they've reacted to these changes in their lives and the various eccentricities they've all developed. I'd say what the book particularly succeeds at is drawing you in with the character development, creating all these puzzle pieces, and then somehow seemingly fitting them all together in the last third of the book in ways that make sense, that seem like they shouldn't. The payoff is amazing, but it also comes out of nowhere. It's like a mystery novel almost in that way. It ties together these threads in ways that are comedic, but also heartwarming, and really develops a connection between the reader and the family. We have one more submission today, and it comes from a reader who says, I've been watching some shows about the relationships between Native Americans and American society at large.
It saddens me to see the social problems on reservations, and I'm interested in reading nonfiction about this. So probably my favorite book on this topic is Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. It's a true life murder mystery in some ways, but it's also a deep exploration of how Native Americans are systemically taken advantage of in American society. It concerns the Osage Indian Nation in Oklahoma. And in the 1920s, oil was discovered beneath the ground of their reservation, making them the richest people per capita in the world at the time. So they lived in luxury after this. They lived a life of luxury, but afterwards, it didn't take too long for people outside the tribe to take advantage of their situation, because people who weren't Native American, they didn't care about the well-being of the tribe members, and they just wanted to exploit them for their resources and their wealth. It didn't take long before members of the tribe quickly started disappearing in mysterious circumstances, and the local law enforcement was reluctant to do anything about it, investigate these in any meaningful way, because it simply didn't value their lives. You get some really great insight into the lives of the members of the tribe, as well as the non-members who lived in the area. Eventually, the members of the tribe were forced to have guardians of their estates, could only be non-members. So they started intermarrying, but this also led to them being taken advantage of by the guardians of their estate, and this brought on a host of all new issues and really laid the groundwork for systemic disenfranchisement. Now, at the same time, in American history, the FBI had just been founded. When local law enforcement fails to do anything about it, the FBI steps up in what became one of their first major homicide investigations. It's these two really fascinating stories, very American stories in their own right, coming together at the same time in our history. And we see how the FBI is able to infiltrate the tribe so they could get a better look at how the tribal members are being exploited. This book is currently being turned into a movie by Martin Scorsese, and I think it's an excellent idea because so many of these issues in the book about the role of American government, ill treatment, Native American culture, society, and the way they're viewed by society at large are still really significant, pertinent issues, and I think it's great to shed some light on that. The last book I wanted to talk about is called Our History is the Future: Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance by Nick Estes. At the heart of this story is the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota and how they set out to block construction of the Dakota Access oil pipeline, which eventually grew to be the largest indigenous protest movement in the 21st century. This is the heart of the story, and Estes goes back and forth between how they were able to prevent the construction of the pipeline, along with many other stories of infringements on Native American land. It is often a really heartfelt book and does a great job of the ongoing struggle to be seen as equals in the United States. And in doing so, he goes all the way back to the founding of the United States, back to when Pilgrims first came over. He goes all the way back to the 1600s, but he also uses contemporary examples to show that there's so much work yet to be done. And in this way, the book functions as a history of this struggle, but also a manifesto of how to move forward and how to mend these relations, and how this is not something that will come to a neat, tidy endpoint, but is something that will require constant vigilance. So please check out those books if you're interested in any of those subjects or genres. And I wanted to let you know the EBPL podcast can be listened to at anchor.fm/EBPL library or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to Melissa Hosick, our editor, And thank you for listening. Hope to be back real soon. Thank you.